Hi, I'm Heather Staines, one of the Charleston Conference directors and a senior consultant at Delta Think. We're joined today by Lorcan Dempsey. Welcome, Lorcan. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, glad to be here.
Some of you may recognize Lorcan from his keynote from the conference back in November. So we're really excited to be able to record a leadership interview for you today. So why don't we just kick off a little bit and tell us a little bit about yourself?
I grew up in Ireland, worked for a while in Dublin Public Libraries. Left Ireland, though, as many people did, just before Celtic Tiger, and as many people did, I went to the UK. I worked for many years at the University of Bath in a sort of centre that was originally called the Centre for Catalogue Research, later became the UK Office for Library and Information Networking, and it provided sort of policy advice, R&D support to the British Library initially, to JISC, which many of your listeners will be familiar with, the higher education, further education agency in the UK that provides networking data and various other services. And we worked with libraries throughout the UK. I then moved to JISC itself at really quite a formative and interesting time through the early 90s, mid 90s, at a time when people were sort of figuring out what the network was going to do to libraries, to information resources, research and education. And so I moved to JISC. I had oversight of the variety of ways in which JISC supported informational activity in libraries and in higher and further education. So I worked there for a while. Before then, I was recruited to OCLC in the US, and there I oversaw OCLC research for a long time, but then also had some broader responsibilities within the organization for membership and for planning and some other activities. So I was there for quite a while. I left OCLC a few years ago, and then unexpectedly, I had a very interesting experience for 2 years as a visiting professor at the Information School at the University of Washington. They have a laudable scheme where they bring in somebody for a couple of years who does some teaching, does some other work, and I found that very interesting, very rewarding, and very educational. So, from the point of view of what I've done, I mean, I've been based in libraries, I've worked in libraries, but much of my working life has been thinking about more horizontal research development policy within a library context, working for organizations that have that horizontal infrastructural element, whether JISC in the UK or OCLC in the US. So it's been a very interesting journey adjacent to libraries of all types.
Yeah. So for folks who are joining us today who were not present at your keynote in Charleston, I do encourage everyone to go back and take a look at that. Um, One of your takeaways in that keynote was that library education should think about libraries as social organizations. And in that context, a set of skills that would be required to manage them as social organizations. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think especially in educational context, there's temptation to think of libraries as a set of techniques. That there are a set of techniques that need to be learned, and these are what you use in libraries. But also, until quite recently, the library tended to be defined by the building and the collection, and very much in those physical terms. Even though obviously that identity has blurred or dissolved to some extent over a period of quite a few years now, and maybe accelerated in the pandemic. But I think from a library point of view, that identity is quite persistent. However, when you think about a library of all types, a national library, a library in a community college, a large urban public library, small rural library, they are embedded in a community to which they're responsible in some way. They have a variety of partners which are increasingly essential to them as they deliver their services, whether it's a local food bank, a local charity, or whether it's the Office of Research or the people responsible for the learning management system or whatever, depending on the particular library. So I think the library is embedded in this situation. And at the same time, the focus of the library on the core centrality of the collection, this is still very important, but that collection is no longer necessarily the sole object of attention, and the way in which the library provides services has moved quite significantly. So the library has become much more relational in a variety of ways. So the academic library supports teaching and research workflows. It engages more readily with faculty and their research, with people doing teaching, with students as they are figuring out how to get their work done. The public library is very much involved maybe in educational goals that a city might have, reading levels. It may be very involved in terms of support for immigrant populations. It may have a role in relation to food insecurity in a particular area. So the libraries of all types are embedded in their environments with this whole range of services. And you can see that shift from collection to a more relational view across the range of what they do. So very obvious example is space. Library space in all types of libraries, was originally configured around the collection. It was the place where you had to come and see the collection, and the collections dominate library spaces. Increasingly, libraries are reconfiguring their spaces around engagement with the learning and research process, around engagement with the community in a variety of ways. In terms of the skills, that people need, people increasingly need social and relational skills. If you think about a large urban public library and the types of services it provides and the way in which it is located in relation to other social actors, whether it's social services, education, whatever. Or if you think about an academic library, which has to engage with faculty, has to engage with the Office of Research, has to engage in a variety of ways, those relational and social skills become very important. So, whether it's space skills, from a technology point of view, the core library technology activity used to be the central library system. Now there are a whole variety of technologies in terms of a variety of workflows that might be supported. Large public library may have, customer relationship management software. So the library is located in that social setting, but then also at a higher level, or a different level, if you like, the library exists as an institution. It exists in virtue of a socially agreed function that a community or a society has agreed to support. So the public library is a manifestation of a social agreement about the role of an organization that supports equity and learning in the community. And an academic library exists in the context of machinery for learning and research support around the types of services that the library provides and the space that the library provides. So the library very much depends on its parent institution for support, and aligns itself with that, and has an institutional role that is recognized in that. And that has sort of come to the fore somewhat recently, because a lot of these questions are up for discussion. What is the role of education? What is the investment in education? What is the role of public or civic infrastructure for learning? All of these things have become objects of discussion or organized challenge or question.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like libraries have more and more and more functions, on their plate. I can recall, I don't know, some number of years ago when conversations started around content moving toward open access. Someone might hazard to say, "Oh, what's that going to mean, for the library, if they're no longer, organizing collections?" And I think, wow, how far off, we were on, what the impacts of that were going to be, particularly now when libraries are doing digital literacy and AI education and other things on campus that are just bringing kind of more and more under their purview and not less.
I think, library directors, really going back to what I was saying about social and relational skills, library directors increasingly have to be good storytellers. They have to be able to explain the role of the library within their community, but also, whether it's an academic library or a public library. And that sort of storytelling positioning is really very important. Now, in parallel, you've seen the growth in the desire for data to support advocacy of a variety of types. But as the role of the library stretched and morphed in a variety of ways, the sort of public or the university's perception of the library may not have morphed in quite the same way. So there's now a continual storytelling positioning type of discussion going on. And I think how people talk about the library has changed in that regard. I was very struck, speaking of Columbus, Pat Lazinski stepped down a couple of years ago as the director or CEO of Columbus Metropolitan Libraries. And I was very struck a few years ago when I saw him in a presentation say that, 20 years ago, he would have said he was in the libraries business or whatever, but today he's in the Columbus business. So the public librarian were very much, when they talk about the library, they'll talk about the library in the context of not what a wonderful collection they have, or not they'll talk about the library in the context of how they are improving educational outcomes, how they are making a difference. And similarly, in a university setting, people will talk about how they are impacting the lives of students in various ways, how they are supporting various university goals. So that again is we used to think about libraries very much as standalone, but they are very much embedded in the environments they serve.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to do a lot of interviews with librarians, and we hear more often than not that there is involvement from the library up through the chain with the university strategic plan, and that is that's great when that involvement is there, and that the both organization and its parts are kind of pulling towards the same goals. So that's good to hear.
One of the things that struck me coming to the US was the quite different patterns of funding for public libraries, and how they could change in different areas, whether they are reporting up to a board, whether they report up to a mayor, but then also the particular funding base in terms of which tax revenue and so on goes towards them. But what has been really especially interesting from a library positioning point of view is how the public library very much has to explain itself explain its value because there is a direct connection between its funding and the ballot box. So I think that is something that is really quite interesting and means that certainly public libraries and certainly larger public libraries, have a big focus on positioning the library as a valuable community partner because of that direct link with the ballot box and their funding.
Yeah, we don't often get that many public librarians at Charleston, but we're always talking about how we can make it more valuable. Now, just going back to your some of the things you touched on in your keynote, you described the state of libraries as very fragmented, and just hearing you, talk about the value that libraries bring in different contexts, different locations, over time. How does that fragmentation maybe hinder or serve as an obstacle to collective infrastructure and shared action, that libraries might wish to undertake? What if that were not the case of that fragmentation? What do you think might be possible?
I mean, libraries are sort of inevitably structured in well, not inevitably, but understandably structured in the way they are, given that they are creatures largely of local funding. So academic library is funded by its institution to exist. So its responsibilities are, in the first place, to that institution. Now, they may have some secondary obligations, in a publicly funded institution to statewide activity or something. And certainly, a public library similarly is responsive to the community that supports it. So the way in which libraries are organized, they are organized as local infrastructure. Given the history, that's probably inevitable because the library is a creature of a physical world where, if you want to access information or the sources of creativity or that sort of machinery of creative production, the materials have to be distributed to be close to you. So the library, emerged as a mechanism that could assemble information materials in a way that was convenient for you and then also affordable if the community collectively paid for them, or the academy, the university collectively, or college collectively paid for them. So the library, from that point of view, was very much a local physical entity. And then as we moved into a digital world, obviously the library had to adjust in various ways, and it began to adjust through, initially anyway, moving to licensing materials, or maybe to sharing systems infrastructure. But that local contact, that local funding, that local priority setting all remained. However, at the same time, since the mid-90s or wherever, scale has become very important. So for better and increasingly people may feel for worse, much of our lives are dominated by large platforms which are able to aggregate a large audience, which have scale effects, which have network effects because they bring together lots of people for advantage. So the network favors scale in a variety of ways. And you have seen over time, many of the providers that serve libraries have consolidated or acquired more scale. And certainly that world in which the library operates in a variety of the ways in which information is created, used, shared, and so on, happens through these platforms in various ways. So historically, certainly the library has had to navigate that world. And It does it again in slightly different ways, and you can see this depending on some national contexts. So in a UK context, JISC is very important because it provides some scale at the national level in, for example, licensing, or in, thinking about data infrastructure, or in providing thinking. I think one of the important things of scale is just to concentrate some research and development or thinking about what might happen. In a US context, that is tends, not to happen to the same extent. You don't tend to have, national or federal initiatives of an infrastructural nature. You do certainly have it at the state level. So in an Ohio context, you have Ohio Link, for example, and many states will support some shared infrastructure through their educational or state apparatus in some way. And certainly, again, in a US context, you have enormous activity around bottom-up consortia, peer networks, a whole variety. And to some extent, what these organizations are doing is they're trying to achieve some scale in this network world. And they concentrate a variety of things. So they concentrate negotiating capacity, which is very much a part of the discussion at Charleston, and consortia, a very big part of that. They concentrate systems infrastructure, so many of them will have shared systems. They may concentrate digital infrastructure in a variety of ways. They're trying to achieve some scale within the consortial setting. I think also, very importantly, and I think this is underestimated, those types of consortial settings or national environments in other contexts are really, really important from a learning point of view. I mean, obviously, some consortia have formal learning or formal professional development, but I think the as it were, soft power of those organizations is that they bring people together to pool their uncertainty, to compare solutions, to discuss problems, to do some norming around the future, to do informal or formal mentoring, recruitment. So all of those things, again, really quite important in helping the individual library overcome some of its singleness. So I think I think you've seen through all of that consortial activity, ways in which libraries are addressing particular issues. And if you think, certainly a large academic library will have a whole variety of affiliations. They'll have some for their regional infrastructure. They may belong to a bigger organization where they do collective print management. They may belong to some organizations to, they may confer at CNI. They may negotiate through another organization. So the libraries have found a variety of ways of consorting to achieve some scale in particular areas. Now, in that way, they have a certain amount of scale and they have a certain amount of local touch, local responsiveness, which I think is a good balance. You can always argue that they would benefit by all sharing in one big system somewhere or doing something else. But the way things are organized, you have to work with existing infrastructure. Certainly there is, generally, as in any other environment like this, a collective action issue. There may be, certain areas where, it's difficult for a whole group to move in the same direction because there may be, there are always going to be local counter interests and so on. So those types of things. I think as well, from a more general lobbying point of view, you've seen the emergence of a variety of national level organizations that tend to concentrate advocacy and political representation or influence in some way. And again, libraries are used to affiliating with ARSL or ULC or ARL to think about how they influence the policy environment or the world around them in various ways.
Now you touched on this a little bit around vendor consolidation and the changes in technology, but if we think about library vendor relationships, I know we get a lot of vendor participation, at the conference. One of the things we were talking about when we prepared for this was how the move to the cloud has kind of, I guess, changed the relationship between libraries and vendors. Maybe one of the shifts was when you had, local installations, versus,
Mm-hmm.
once you're moving to the cloud. And I a few years back, I interviewed Bar Weinstein from Ex Libris, and he was talking about in the early times of trying to get a library to pilot with them, in the cloud, for kind of an ILS. And I think you forget the complexities, around some of
Mm-hmm.
these relatively large shifts. And while I always like to point out to people that there's no such thing as the cloud, it's just somebody else's server, it has, simplified maybe or changed migrations from systems, or the amount of touch points that vendors, different type of touch points and training that vendors have had to do with libraries. It's not just putting in an order now. It's more complexity around a relationship that is a little bit more straightforward in some ways, because maybe there's a switch that you flip somewhere, but in other ways, you're talking about more of a learning curve with some of the systems.
I mean, certainly the cloud, and I think one of the things about AI and the more recent developments is that people maybe are becoming a little bit more conscious of this. But I mean, the cloud certainly has boots of concrete. I think we're very clear that the cloud has boots of concrete, that you are, you're looking at, as you say, somebody else's infrastructure, and the amount of infrastructure that we're currently building to support a variety of things obviously has impinged on public consciousness in important and stark ways, given the current level of investment in data centers. We drove past a data center being built the other day, and we're amazed at just the scale of the thing. Yeah, I mean, I think from a day-to-day point of view, the ways in which work is distributed or the type of work may have changed. I think also it means that certain smaller libraries, can potentially join in to a shared system, in a way that some years ago they may not have been able to do. I think one of the things that has happened is that historically libraries shared resources between themselves, but the move to the cloud has facilitated the ability of libraries to actually share systems, to share data within those systems. And I think we will see increasingly services built on top of that, in terms of more sophisticated ways of managing that collective resource, now that you are sitting in a shared instance of a system somewhere, which allows you to do certain things. I think also, I mean, it is interesting to see services, for example, like JSTOR's, the digital stewardship service, which can be attempted now in this setting, where they can bring to bear a sort of pipeline of services in the cloud, in terms of taking local data and so on, that would probably have been very difficult to deploy locally. One phenomenon that I think deserves more discussion or explanation is SpringShare. The LibGuides. I mean, LibGuides, an extraordinary success or phenomenon, I think, although we don't normally think about that. All of a sudden, the slightly jokingly, I sort of describe them as Ivy or something. people began to be interested in resource guides. Then you had a few libguides. Then if you blinked, you turn back and you've got all of these libraries deploying libguides. So libguides are very, very pervasive of certainly academic space, and then they're also used in other places. And clearly then you have the other services from the SpringShare portfolio. But I think the cloud-based nature of all of that, again, is something that allowed that to happen. And I think although, you might emphasize the functionality or whatever, I think one of the important things about libguides is that when it came to an institution, because it was in the cloud, but because it wasn't a huge system, it was probably, it might have been below a certain budgetary threshold. It didn't require big interaction with local systems people. You didn't have to go over to the computer center and say, this is what we want to do. So the deployment of libguides was very much enabled by that sort of ability. And again, I imagine the price threshold was probably a factor here, was the ability to turn on cloud-based services. And I think the speed with which they were adopted really, really quite interesting, and something I think that's deserving of some historic attention or discussion or write-up.
Make note
But
of
then
that. Maybe that would be a good topic for a session in Charleston.
yeah, but then you can see now with a variety of other things where the adoption is quicker than it might have been if stuff had to be locally deployed. Now, on the other hand, I mean, larger libraries do still, spend quite a bit of time thinking of, with thinking about systems and services. I mean, especially given the sort of, if you think about the interest in open source repositories or whatever, quite a bit of systems attention, the ability to introduce and scale new systems and services has changed. The ability to work with data in particular ways has changed. The promise of much greater collaboration within shared systems, I think, is very real and has been achieved to some extent. The whole ability of consortia to treat their collective collection as a single collection because they're all on the same system, all of those things have been as a result of that ability to bring things together in a cloud context.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's giving me some food for thought. I don't want to let you go without asking you a little bit about the teaching experience that you referenced in your introduction. And when we were planning for today, we were talking about incentives for those teaching in iSchools, maybe to not be as visible in the same way that someone teaching in a business school might be. You talked about the importance of storytelling in regards to library directors, but for the the workaday professionals that are teaching the next generation, could you talk a little bit more about that, maybe visibility issue that you were referencing?
Yeah, I think career preparation, library education, quite interesting. And obviously, as I pointed out, in some libraries, quite a lot of recruitment now happens outside of, that sort of MLS, those ranks in terms of, specialist skills, research knowledge, whatever. So certainly that is, a big trend that I didn't really discuss. I think the variety of schools, is really quite wide. So, you might have a pole or a center of gravity in certain R1 institutions where the pressures, the research pressures on faculty are quite strong in terms of the university tenure, the the ways in which you are led to think about the refereed research article as the pinnacle of sort of achievement, but also in terms of PhDs and so on, an increasingly specialized view of things. So the academic incentives, are geared around those sort of academic goals, and there's a tendency to think of LIS as an academic discipline, rightly or wrongly, I wrote about this in some of the materials that I referenced during this LIS Forward initiative. But the temptation to think about LIS as an academic discipline and be inside. Another pole or center of gravity is around more professional incentives, we'll say, where clearly from a teaching point of view and so on, there's a big focus on credentialing, on professional advancement, on engagement with the community. And I think overall, as a community, those who are the education research partners in the academy of the library community tend to be in situations where they certainly have academic incentives, or they're in situations where they're just very busy because they may not be in a very big school, or so there's quite a bit of teaching. So I do think the community as a whole would benefit from more engagement in terms of conference attendance, policy, opinion, whatever from those quarters. Now, the business school is an obvious comparator, but it may be misleading in various ways, because business schools tend to have some scale and support, which is not always the case with the LIS schools. What would be interesting, I think, and I'm sure that some of this may exist. I think it would be very interesting to compare library education with sort of pink collar education in other contexts. So what about nursing? What about public health? What about education? What about hospitality management? Maybe industrial relations, I don't know, but a variety of academic disciplines that have similar pressures in various ways. Clearly, there's a strong pink collar dynamic at play, I think, but also thinking about areas that maybe don't have a big theoretic base, don't have a big research culture, don't have a lot of research funding, very professionally aligned. I do think it would be interesting to see a little bit more investigation of some of those types of question. What struck me in Charleston in the conversations afterwards was just, I think you're always going to have a, sort of research practice divide or whatever. But going back to what I was saying about libraries, it does seem to me that it's a big challenge for those schools because of the ways in which libraries have changed, because of the variety of ways in which library staff engage. So you may still want, knowledge about, data science or knowledge organization or just programming, but how many people within the library are actually going to use those types of skills as opposed to some of the more social and relational types of things that people do, or the engagement or the liaison, the advocacy. So I think there is a challenge certainly for those schools thinking about the types of people going into libraries.
It's hard. I remember when I started in publishing, we thought we were all going to have to learn, HTML, because I guess we thought we were going to make our web pages. So I suppose, just thinking the rate of change is probably hard for the curriculum to keep up. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking this time with us today. Always have a lot of things to think about when I go away after we've had our conversations. I hope that we will see you again at a future Charleston conference.
Well, thank you very much for making the time and for reaching out.
So, my pleasure. Thank you.